This is Charles Epstein for the X Factor podcast. In fact, this is our 11th podcast. Those of you who've listened from the beginning, thanks for your support. For all of you who are here for the first time, welcome. Hopefully it's the first of many. Today's guest is David Foote, Chief Analyst and Chief Research Officer for the eponymous Foote Partners, innovators of advanced techniques for benchmarking enterprise tech jobs, skills, supply/demand, and compensation, tracking/forecasting tech labor trends, and analyzing human factors in technology development. He's a former Gartner analyst and Silicon Valley executive. David and I are actually planning on doing a series of talks on what we're calling the big shift, as David and I will get into today and in subsequent pods. We're in the middle of several tectonic shifts in the global workforce, a massive generational shift, shifts in technology investments, job shifts, a shift emphasizing soft skills, and shifts in skills pay. So to discuss these shifts and their impact on the future of work, without further ado, Mr. David Foote. David.
Hey, Charles. Nice to be back.
Yes, and you are speaking to me from where exactly?
I'm in Black Rock, Connecticut today.
Very, very nice. David, so thanks so much for taking the time. Really looking forward to having these series of conversations, this whole idea of the big shift. But before we get into it, tell our listeners a little bit about Foote Partners, when you started the company, what inspired you to start it. Perhaps most importantly, what about your work still excites you and gets you out of bed on a very cold morning in the dead of winter up there?
Well, I don't know if my work would ever excite me to get out of bed on a cold morning in the dead of winter, or down south, get me up on a hot, oppressive, muggy South Florida morning, which is where we're headquartered. But necessity is the mother of invention. Mm-hmm. And I was a Gartner analyst, and I wanted desperately to start a service for CIOs. Gartner had no research service specifically for chief information officers, which, coming into Gartner from the business end of working in the Silicon Valley and designing products, but also working with mainly on the business side, what I saw was a number of CIOs coming into their positions who were very different than their predecessors. They were coming in from the business side. And I said, I think this job is basically going to be inhabited in the future by business people and MBAs and strategic thinkers, not just people managing a tech cost center. I tried, but I couldn't get Gartner to think about doing something for CIOs, which makes no sense if you think about it. But at the time, Gartner was just sort of selling to second and third level technology people. And of course, if you know anything about Gartner, they're very good about analyzing the technology side of it. But at the time, in the early to mid 90s, a bunch of founders, these are the first employees, original employees at Gartner, decided to break away, start their own analyst firm. It was called Metagroup. And you don't have to imagine what their goal was in doing that. And exactly what happened. They decided to, create this firm, go public, make a lot of money, and then sell themselves back to Gartner, which is they did. And a lot of them ended up back at Gartner. But that's, how American entrepreneurism and capitalism works. And so the CEO of that company said, yeah, I'd love to start a CIO service, the first one in the industry. So I went over there to Metagroup and did that. What I discovered when you talk to CIOs is exactly what I thought I would discover, which is, I would say 70% of their questions were not about technology. They said, that's the easy part. We rely on like Gartner and Metagroup and Forrester for that. What we really struggle with is the people part, the human side of this, and how we deal, how we hire, how we train, who these people are, trying to explain to our HR department all this new technology. They have no background in technology. They don't even understand the acronyms that are in the job descriptions that we send them. And it was a real disconnect. And not to get into too much detail, but I started my career in HR before I was ever a tech guy. I have an MBA in HR marketing. And so my first jobs were out in San Francisco working for I think they're a Fortune pen company right now in their HR department. And I said, well, I know the answer to some of these questions. There are consulting firms that specialize in this stuff. And a lot of them had offered me jobs out of MBA school, but I didn't take them. And I went to them and I said, so we have a common client. They're a chief information officer, and they say they can't get basic information from you about even how to pay a lot of these sort of new tech jobs. And they came back to me and said, well, if they want to hire us as, to do a multi-client study, they can hire us. So I went back to these CIOs and I said, well, my job is to answer your questions. And I don't have an answer for this question because the people that should have the answer don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer those questions for you. I will design research that doesn't exist right now to give you the answers. And the first questions they had were, how do you pay a web developer? All these jobs that didn't exist on any salary surveys that their HR department could find. I said, let's look at all the jobs you can't get any data for, and I'm going to actually create a compensation survey for you guys. I'm going to give you these answers. And Charles, it was wildly successful. And I realized that I was onto something. Nobody had this information anywhere in the world. I said, how often does that happen in a lifetime? So I kept feeding them more and more information and benchmarks that had to do with all new technology. So it went from there into data warehousing and business intelligence and into the web. Mm-hmm. I was astonished that this information wasn't readily available. So I saw an opportunity and I said, this is a company. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave Metagroup and I'm going to start my own company doing this because Metagroup doesn't seem to be very interested in going into the HR space or even into the business space. They want to stay in the tech space. So that's what I did. That's how this, again, necessity is the mother of invention. Nobody was doing it. I decided I'd do it. Now, what makes it exciting for me? Well, we do everything that has to do with benchmarking and analyzing and forecasting the tech workforce. The tech workforce, as I mentioned in an article I wrote for CIO Magazine on the next 10 years of IT, I did that in 1997. I basically said, well, what was going to happen is a lot of IT was going to be outsourced. So this wouldn't be something that they would be doing, but they would be working with outsiders. And so I said that I thought that what would be left after all the outsourcing would be a lot of architects and analysts and project managers. And I couldn't see that applications development, that was actually applications, not systems applications, but, touching the customer, that they wouldn't probably outsource that. They do a lot of their customer-facing applications. And that's pretty much what happened. So I realized, oh, my God, I'm good at forecasting. I had never really known that I had an ability to do that, but it turns out that I did, and I could teach it to people. So that's what we've been doing. What gets me out of bed and why I love it so much is that if you look at technology is changing every day, every week, every month, and somebody has to be able to conceive, build, design, build, and implement technology. That's a people thing. It's increasingly becoming a business, a AI thing, a technology thing. As we're doing less and less programming and coding, and giving a lot of this up to the machines themselves. So that's really that's the simple answer to your question.
Speaking of forecasting, we do want to get into the big shift stuff. You guys do so much excellent research and put out so many trenchant reports. I think the most recent one that hit my inbox was on IT certifications with a pay surge. I think it's setting a new mark since 2006. Of all the research you've done, let's say over the last 6 months, is anything that really leaps out at you that really surprised you?
Well, on the issue of certification, maybe some of those in the audience know that compensation and rewards for tech professionals are quite a bit different than a lot of other people in the enterprise. And part of it is because technology is moving so quickly, and every company is a tech company now, right? Every company is a tech company.
That is your mantra, and it has long been your mantra.
Yes, and it's been that way for 20 years that we have a contest here. I'll pay $5,000 to anybody in my company who can tell me a company that can show me a company that is not a tech company, that either technology is not the product, how they deliver it, or how they support it. No one's won that bet yet. They've tried. But what we discovered back in the late 90s as we were doing compensation was that we saw companies paying cash pay premiums for skills. And we thought, well, that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't that be covered under salary? So those of you listening who are compensation professionals who understand, the administration of pay would understand that usually in a company, people are paid by grade. You put them in a grade, there's a salary range in that grade, and they can't go above it. The only way you can go above that salary range is to get promoted into the next grade and stuff like that. But companies were struggling with all these jobs. Like they would have a software engineer that would be working in a data center, a software engineer, a bunch of them working in an e-commerce group, and one working in a digital product group. Well, they're all software engineers. At the end of the day, they all do the same thing. The only difference is if you were in a digital product group versus a data center, you have a slightly different set of skills and knowledge. But still, you're a software engineer. Companies were struggling on how to what to do with these people, how to pay them, how to administrate pay for them, what group they should be in, and they started creating. It became chaos. So what companies decided to do is, well, we'll pay them all the same, but the guys over in the data center, they're a little more valuable to us, and from a total cash perspective, they should be making more. But we're not going to upset our system by giving them a separate grade and giving them some kind of elite status. What we're going to do is find out, well, what are the skills that they have, certified or non-certified, that makes them different, and let's just pay them outside of base for those base salary for those skills. So we'll give them an extra 8 or 9 or 10 or 15%. And that was smart. We just didn't think it would be, we thought it was a short-term solution for dealing with this basic problem of how you get people paid when there's so much multidimensionality to their jobs. And also at a time when the same job with the same job could have 25 or 30 different job titles. Like there was a lack of standardization in job titles. So this thing about pay, cash pay premiums for certifications that you mentioned here, we started tracking that as an element of pay. What we discovered is, 25 years later, and we're updating this data every 90 days, it still exists. It became a bona fide element of pay for technology workers. Why we follow it is it helps us understand supply and demand of skills, and that's what companies are really doing now. They're not reflexively hiring full-time workers. If they need some kind of skill, they'll say, well, do we have it in our workforce? No. Well, can we get it from a consultant, a part-time worker, a contingent worker, a gig worker? We just need to get this skill and a certain level of intensity in our company. As you know, the slowest way to get anything in your company is to hire people, because it might take 6 months to find people and hire them, whereas it might take 6 hours to find a consultant to do that work. So, companies are in the business of being competitive. They have to do things quickly. They have an idea. They've got to get it to market, in a week, or a couple of days, not in 3 months or 6 months. So in tracking this, what's interesting is right now we're tracking and reporting 632 certifications. Where we know the cash market value, because companies are literally paying cash outside of salary for these, and we're tracking 710 non-certified skills. The interesting thing about this is, whereas salaries, I would argue, don't change radically year to year. I mean, there's cost of living and things like that. But skills are an incredibly volatile market. A skill can be worth a lot of money, and then 6 months later, it's lost 20% of its value in the market. It's a very volatile market for skills because technology is very volatile.
Sure.
And the consumption of technology is very volatile, and so are companies' business plans and how they become profitable and make money or get market share. They have to move very quickly, and these technologies offer them the ability to do that if they know how to, again, design them, build them, launch them, and support them. So certifications recently showed a substantial increase over the last 6 months in their value. But here's the story, Charles. Certifications in the tech world and being able to earn extra money for certifications, it's a it's just a small subset of what we call technology. Certifications are mainly for infrastructure skills, systems networking, for security, architecture, project management. A lot of them are what we call vendor dependent. Somebody sells you some technology, they're going to stand behind. They're going to say, we're going to come in and train your people, and we're going to get them a certification to show that they passed a test. Even though they got 30% of the questions wrong on the test, they still get a certification. So, that affects the value in people's minds. And I think the biggest headline in our most recent quarterly IT skills and certification Pandex is the gap between what people are willing to pay for non-certified skills, which is a much larger group of skills that covers much more than technology or than certifications. The gap between what companies are willing to pay for, on average, for an individual certified skill versus an individual IT certification has never been wider. It's on average about the equivalent of 9.6% of base pay.
Huh, wow.
Non-certified skills and only like 6.5% on the certification side. So think about that.
We definitely will get into that in more depth in one of the subsequent conversations we have. You mentioned technology being inherently volatile, which I think feeds naturally into the big shift. If you would, David, give our listeners some background. What does the big shift mean? How would you define it? What's driving it? What's the context?
The day before we recorded this podcast, this was yesterday, Oprah Winfrey did a show on ABC saying, what is AI? Trying to bring AI to the masses. And in that show, she interviewed 5 people, many of whom you would know from the worlds of the federal government, from Sam Altman from OpenAI interviewed the director of the FBI. And she started the show by saying, something big is happening here. Like, are we on the cusp of a new era? I feel it. She said, I'm 7 decades old and I've never felt anything like this. There's a certain amount of fear in her voice, I think. Not just wonder, but fear. And the only person who sort of looked at this issue of what is AI, what should we know about it, where are we going to be, what does it mean to us, was Bill Gates, who mentioned that there have been several other industrial revolutions that we've had in the United States. And I happen to think he was onto something with this, because this is the fourth, if you go back to the 1700s, which was the first industrial revolution, that had dramatic, cataclysmic changes. It's amazing, but we don't look to the past usually to understand the future. And the reason we don't look at things like the first industrial revolution, which was the steam engine, and the second industrial revolution, which was the internal combustion engine, is because it's kind of listening to your grandfather talk about the old days. Like, who wants to listen to grandpa talk about the old days? But Bill Gates mentioned it because he's on to something. And as analysts, we look forward sometimes by looking back. Is this something we've seen before? Let's compare it to what we've seen before. For instance, you would say, well, let's look at digital transformation. Then let's look at AI. Does it look any different than the internet, which most of us have experienced in our lifetime, unless you're very young and you're listening to this podcast? Is there anything that we learned from our fear, our misunderstanding, our reluctance to go online that could inform us in terms of our fear and our reluctance to use AI? And so a couple of things I just wanted to bring up that I think can kind of get us started in this big shift that we're talking about is to look at these first 2 industrial revolutions, which I'm telling you was in 1769 with an efficient steam engine, and in 1867, which was the internal combustion engine. And of course, internet really came in, its genesis is in the 70s, but it really didn't come into our lives, most of us, till it was commercialized in the mid-90s. So what do we need just briefly to know about this? And again, I want you to listen to this part of the podcast as it informs what we're doing right now in terms of how we regard AI, the benefits, the dangers, the uncertainties on our careers and our jobs over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, no matter what age you are, because we're going to get into this a little later in the podcast. What should you know if you're a Gen Z or a millennial versus if you're currently a boomer and you're 60 years old and still working? Okay, so the first thing is I want to talk about how these fueled economic growth. and the creation of jobs. I mean, the steam engine basically what it did was powered machinery, and it enabled mass production in factories. This allowed us to produce goods faster, more efficiently, and in larger quantities. And then you look at the internal combustion engine. This transformed agriculture, for instance, through mechanized equipment like tractors, combines, and farm equipment. It allowed farmers to cultivate larger areas of land. So again, productivity. If you look at the steam engine, another thing is it shifted us to factory work. People moved from rural areas and agricultural work to cities for jobs in factories. It created sort of the initial urbanization. It changed the structure of society, increased the size of cities, and created new economic opportunities for a lot of people. Just the same with internal combustion engines. It created an automobile industry that became one of the largest and most influential sectors in the global economy. Car manufacturing created millions of jobs, supported all kinds of ancillary industries like steel, rubber, glass production, and it contributed significantly to economic growth.
So
I could go on and on about this, but
I think you make a really good point. I just want to make sure for our listeners. So what you're essentially saying, you began by talking about Oprah Winfrey, and she was expressing some trepidation about AI, and you're talking about looking to the past, these previous incredibly disruptive, but ultimately very productive industrial revolution. If you have trepidation about AI, look to some of these historical examples. They've ultimately proven to be net positives.
Yes, and we, as human beings, and I contend that basic human nature hasn't changed since the caveman days. It's just gotten more sophisticated. So as human beings, we naturally fear things we don't know. But if you look at these, and even if you look at the internet as an industrial revolution, it created so much goodness and things that we love and that helped us. It created all kinds of opportunities. It created huge social and cultural change that we all, not only, we may have feared it, but we got used to it and we grew to love it. The fact that we carry phones around and we get nervous when we don't have a phone or a digital watch on, because it keeps us in contact with our families, with the world. We can order things on the fly. We can get information. There was a time when we feared that too. We just didn't know. So what I'm saying is that right now, the difference in this current revolution, which is the fourth industrial revolution, which is digital, is that things are happening. It's accelerated technological advancements. It's accelerated things by about 10 times. So if you're looking at, well, what does this mean for my career? Or what does this mean for my family? Things that you think are going to happen a year from now are going to happen 3 months from now. Things that you think in the future are going to happen 2 years from now, they're going to happen 9 months from now. That's how quick things are going. And that's something that has been mentioned a lot about the current revolution, if you will, and that Oprah talked about to, again, the masses. She's very good at communicating to the masses. It's happening so quickly, and I think that's the fear that people have. It's the fear of missing out, but it's also the fear of, do I lose my job? Or because about 20 to 25% of the jobs that exist today will be gone, but there'll be a lot of new jobs being created. But for most of us, I would argue that it's not, AI won't replace humans, but humans with AI will replace humans without AI. So your ability right now to get comfortable with AI and figure out ways to use it and teach people in the company, show that there's value to it, and mentor and teach other people, coach them to do that. That is how you survive. And that's what companies are looking for right now. They won't even hire. I've had many CSOs, chief security officers and chief information security officers, tell me that they've always hired on technical skills, and to some extent they've hired on marketing skills, because as they're trying to sell security to the board of directors, they want people below them also making the case for why you should be spending discretionary and not just, compliance money on security. They need to make that. But what they're saying now is, I don't really want to hire anybody into our security organization who can't show me that they understand AI. They're interested in it. They have a basic understanding of it, and they may even have an ideas of how they can bring AI into our organization. We're looking for those kind of people. So, that's where we are right now.
Right.
Looking
Right.
for people that, again,
Right.
can use AI and get out in front of it.
Right. No, I think you did a great job of setting the stage, putting the so-called big shift, historical perspective, and what it is we're facing. I want to get into some of the particulars of these shifts, beginning with generational shift, which is happening, as you know, David, as you know better than just about anybody, it's happening right under our feet in a very major way. In a recent slide deck, in fact, you shared with me, you cited a startling stat. Let me see here. It says, in 2030, 75% of the workforce will be Gen Z and millennial. What is this workforce going to look like in a mere 5+ years from now? How will it be different? And what role do you see AI playing? You touched on this just a moment ago. What role do you see AI playing in this generational shift?
Let's first of all define who these generational workers are. So many of you out there have read books, articles, maybe you've seen presentations about, who are the Gen Zs, who are the millennials, who are the Gen Xs, who are the boomers. Like right now, the boomers are people that are around 60 to 78 years of age. The Gen Xs are people who were born between 65 and 80. They're like 44 to 59 right now. The millennials, who were born in the early 80s and go up to like the mid 90s, they're between 28 and 43 years old today. The Gen Zs go down as low as 12 years old to 27. That's today in 2024. Well, what age will they be? Why will the workforce be 75% Gen Z and millennial by 2030? Well, it's 6 years from now. So the millennials will be 34 to 49 years of age by 2030. And the Gen Zs will be 18 to 33 years of age. So that means that those 75% will be 18 to 49 years old. And if you look at generations, that wouldn't surprise you. If you look at today, I think those millennials and Gen Zs, I think, make up about 36% of the population of workers in the United States right now.
Huh.
So that's going to double in the next 6 years. At the same time, the Gen Xers will be, 50 to 65, and the boomers will be 66 to 84. Well, the boomers are not retiring. I'm a boomer. Are you a boomer?
I'm a boomer.
Yeah. We're not exactly retiring. So the idea, I think, and what I want to talk about next is, well, what is it that makes each of these generations special? And I want to talk about it in the idea of, well, what are the attributes of each of them, and what are the opportunities for them in this new world, which is not simply AI. I mean, we're tracking 15 what we call high momentum technologies right now, of which 3 different AI components make up, 3 of the 15. And those are generative AI, industrialized machine learning, and applied AI. And it's very interesting to actually, as long as we're talking about AI, it might be interesting to look at what we do is we look at, well, where's the money going right now in terms of AI? If you look at equity, in terms of people that are building new businesses, what are they investing in? And it might interest you that, and let me just get this data in front of me right now. The interesting thing about this is that right now, people think Gen AI, I mean, they sort of know, I would say the average person would know AI more. And again, the average person being not working in a technology job, say, they think Gen AI is really what AI is all about. But in 2023, about $22 billion of equity investment went to Gen AI. 94 billion in equity investment went into applied AI. What is, and about 10 million into industrialized machine learning. What is applied AI? Well, applied AI is all the things that people who are not technical, and it could be some of this audience right now, the question becomes, what is AI? And we should probably address it, right up front. Most people think AI is, you have some data that goes into some black box called AI, And out of that comes value, right? So you have some, you're doing a job description, or you want to ask a question in Copilot or Chat GPT. You type it in, magic happens, and what happens at the other end is you get this incredible report that they've written, or a business plan they've written, or that is AI's written, or a marketing plan, and that's the value. But those of us who work in applied AI and in industrialized machine learning know that it's not just data. You have to select the data, source it, you have to synthesize it. The AI engine, what is that? It's not a black box. It's data engineering and modeling. You have to clean that data, you have to normalize it, you have to scale it, you have to do what's called feature engineering and exploration, and then you model it. You do model selection, you do evaluation, you do model tuning. Then the value part of it, again, well, that's, we call it operationalizing AI. It's registration, deployment, monitoring it, and retraining. That's what it's about. You can put the same question in every day for a month and get a different answer from your AI engine, whether it's Copilot or ChatGPT or whatever, because it's constantly coming up with new information, which, as you know, increases every day because of sensors that are on just about everything we own. There's so many ways that just data is just flowing in. The constraints in AI is what we worry about a lot, and that were mentioned in this Oprah Winfrey interview. They talked about security and ethics and transparency and bias and legal issues. So there are all of these constraints. The question going forward is, okay, we see a lot of goodness in AI, and you have to think about this as you're going forward in terms of your generation. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, how this plays into the generational aspect of this. You might decide to go into the security side in your career, or the ethics side, or the bias side, or the legal side of AI. That may be your play, depending. I think it has something to do with the generational differences. You have so many choices. You could go into the value side of it, or the data engineering and modeling side, or the data sourcing and selection and cleaning and cleansing side. The idea is that is AI. So this is something that I think we should probably remind people who go through all these podcasts. Let's actually understand what it is, what AI is, not on a 35,000 feet level, but what AI is, depending on where you are in the employment chain, if you will, whether you're working in HR, marketing, corporate department, audit, sales and marketing. There's so many different answers as to how, you can build your career about this and how you can be informed. Yeah. Now the generational aspects. Go ahead if you have a specific question.
No. I was just going to say that we previously did a podcast that we called "Bringing AI Down from the Mountaintop." So it's sort of in that spirit.
Okay. So you want to start with the youngest people? I think we should start with the.
Well, what I wanted to ask you, a couple of questions. If you're Gen Z or millennial, what do you need to do to maximize your value to the organization and improve your career prospects? And then I want to ask you about the older cohort, what they can do. But first, if you're Gen Z or millennial, what do you need to do? How do you need to strategize?
Well, I want to look at both attributes and then opportunities for these people. So millennials, you're talking about people born in 81 to 1996. So these are people that are unique in that they started their lives analog. And then as they grew, the world became digital. So that makes them incredibly great translators between generations. They make, excellent people managers and organizational strategists because they remember the world before it went at a 10x speed digital. So they're the bridge between traditional and new ways of working. They're able to strategize. They're adaptable, able to strategize about how to continuously adapt and also look at resistance issues that people have in using technology, in this case, AI, and about their willingness, how to go from unwilling to change to willing to change. A third of them will never change. are not interested in change. It's like that book, who moved the cheese? Do you remember that book from the
Right.
the
Yes.
90s?
Yes.
How you go about adapting to change or not. And by the way, that book needs to be updated to Who Moved My Job, because the point of that book was most people are fearful about change because they don't believe they have any control over it, how it happens, and when it happens to them. So the insight of that book was what matters most is the attitude you have about change. I would update that today is Who Moved My Job, same premise, that people are fearful of change. But what matters most now is the attitude you have about how your job is changing and how fast you can adapt. So in that regard, if you're looking at, the millennials and the Gen Zs, you've got the millennials who, again, are bridging these two generations. They tend in management to be very empathetic, but also very realistic. They have an ability to demonstrate and teach human skills, which, let's also call them soft skills to the next generation, which is exceptionally technologically driven and oriented. So the attributes that they have are, their experience, balance of tenure and curiosity. They've had multiple roles at multiple organizations. Again, you're talking about people who are currently 28 to 43 years old. So they know a lot about traditional versus new ways of working. And from a human and digital skill point of view, they have a very enviable balance of both relational and technical skills. So what I would say is that your ability to be that translator, to be that bridge, because right now, one of the big things that we see that companies are dealing with AI is integrating new AI tech into their current systems. How do you bridge the new technology with the old technology? And that's something that companies have been doing for decades and decades. And I would say, millennia is how do you adapt new to old? In this case, since things are moving so fast, I think the millennials are the perfect people to, again, strategize about how to continuously adapt and how to deal with people that are unwilling to change and sort of, lead them forward. I love their ability to become managers and sort of overseers of a lot of this stuff. So that now, let's go to the Gen Zs. Well, Gen Zs, again, who are currently, 12 to 27 years old and will be 18 to 23 by 2030, they're digital natives. They expect a tech-first experience. I have a 25-year-old, so I can do a little, family research here as well. And I've watched a lot of her and her friends grow up. Now they're in their mid-20s. I'm watching them go for how they learned, how they were educated, how they moved into the work world. Some of them are into their second jobs now. Some of them are into their third jobs. And they're very tech first. They're sort of intuitive, naturally can learn how to use technology without a lot of deep study. It's very self-guided learning to them. And if anyone has any children or grandchildren, they are your tech support group. I mean, they absolutely understand what it's going. They will fix it before you even get it out of your mouth that you need some kind of thing solved on your mobile phone or your laptop computer. That's what they do. They're kind of like hackers in their mentality. They sort of try things out. They absolutely don't mind failing, which has been a big problem with boomers. We never learned how to fail. Particularly engineers who are boomers. We were taught how to get things right, how to get things perfect. And when things don't go well, you start analyzing, well, what the hell just happened? This generation, they don't have time for that. They don't mind failing. They fail all the time. They expect that the world and the digital world is going to evolve and adapt in new ways. So it's built into them. They're highly online, minimum 10 hours a day. However, they're confrontation avoidant. And again, I'm sort of drawing a very, I'm trying to, not every Gen Z is like this. I'm trying to draw a very broad brush as to what I think the attributes of Gen Zs are and what the opportunities are them for going forward. So not all of them are confrontation avoidant, but they might quit or they have absolutes in terms of their point of view. It's one of the reasons why Gen X the number of job changes Gen X can be expected to have between the age of 18 and 34. They expect about 10 job changes, that they might have 10 different employers in that period. That's
crazy.
Yeah, but that's it. Part of it is that confrontation avoidant part. They're fast learners. They're incredibly fast learners, and they learn a lot, but they have very little deep learning, right?
Right.
So that's why you need the millennials and some of the boomers. They have very little, very deep learning. Well, put it this way, it's limited, somewhat by their age, but somewhat by what I just introduced a moment ago, how they, what their sort of basic level of performance is, what they've learned. They, and I will say, observing my daughter, they were never learning as individuals. They were always learning as groups. I mean, they're so good at working in groups. Now, the last thing I want to say is that I think Gen Zs are deeply concerned about things like sustainability and the future of the planet. The reason why that's important is if you go back to all the equity investments I talked about earlier in these new technologies, what would you guess, Charles, would be by far the largest amount of equity investment, that is money going into new companies? What technologies those would be? Can you even make a guess? If you look at all technology out there and some of the most popular ones, where is most of the money going in terms of investment in technology and new businesses?
Well, would cloud computing be too broad a category? Would it have to be something like AI or?
Well, no, cloud would be good, but this is massively more than cloud. This is
security?
3 times the amount of money. Well, no, I'll tell you, it's sustainability. It's electrification and renewables. Do you drive an electric car?
Hybrid.
Yeah, well, a lot of people do, see. So the greatest amount of equity money is going into electrification and renewables because people are buying it. It's consumer. We're pushing all kinds of electrification, moving off of fossil fuels, and also climate technologies that are beyond electrification and renewables. And this is something that that Gen Zs think about and talk about and want to work in those industries. So that is an opportunity for them, and some of them are pushing their careers in that direction as engineers and also in other roles. But the opportunities for Gen Zs are like, I want to say like robot operators. They work very well with digital tools. They learn fast and autonomously. They're almost sort of robotic in the way they look at things compared to older generations. And not to say that, we're raising a bunch of robots, but their instinct is they work incredibly well with tools. They're very fast and they're very autonomous in how
I hope that doesn't mean they'll ultimately be more inclined to be complicit in our demise, David.
Yes. And we're not talking about those robots that are so popular in Japan, right, with Japanese men. We're not talking about those kind of robots.
No. We're not talking about those.
All right. They will challenge traditional ways of working. They'll suggest alternatives. So be ready for that. That you want them challenging traditional ways, but they don't know what they don't know. But we need people constantly challenging the status quo, and they do it naturally, and they'll suggest alternatives. Now, sometimes they'll be good, sometimes they won't be bad, but it's really good to have people in the workforce that do that. The more you challenge, the better it is. Now, you have older workers in there, as I'll point out in a second as we get to the next generation. Or I mentioned it with the millennials. They're there to bridge the old and the new. They are, in a sense, Gen Z wranglers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Now, rounding the bend, speaking about an older cohort. Now, how does this generational shift land on them? And, I'm not sure exactly how we define the older cohort. Certainly one definition would be baby boomers who are still hanging on.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about boomers. So boomers today being like 60 to 78 years old, 60 to 78. By 2030, they'll be 66 to 84. I'll tell you what the main advice I give to them is don't try to be something you're not. You have to be authentic, because authenticity has become something that comes up again and again and again in our research. I should have mentioned before, we're talking to 4,435 organizations in 38 industries, plus the public sector and the nonprofit sector. So that's where we get our information as analysts and as forecasters. So we hear a lot about authenticity. That's a soft skill. We're not going to talk about that today, but we're going to do a session on soft skills and why they become incredibly important, why we hear about them all the time, why companies are willing to hire on soft skills even more than technology skills, because they say we can't really train on the soft skills that we desperately need, but we certainly can train on the technology skills. So we need to bring in people here that fit very well in our culture. So this is where I'm going to go with the answer to your question. I think for boomers to be authentic and to not try to be something they aren't, and try to learn, try to take on millennials, try to take on a millennial or a Gen Z and what they know. You're likely going to fail because they've lived it and you're just trying to learn it. So I say to millennials, you've got to do 4 things. You've got to be very careful on the industry and the employer that you choose to work with. You've got to choose the right form of employment. Do you want to stay as a full-time worker? You want to go out as a part-timer, a consultant, a gig economy worker, or this new thing called career nomads, which, believe it or not, is something that boomers can do. And I think it's really important that they match themselves to the culture of their employer. And why is this important all of a sudden? Well, for many years, you'd get out of school as a boomer, maybe graduate school, and a number of companies would come to interview at your school. You'd select from one of those jobs, or maybe you'd launch your own job search. You were probably going for companies that had some kind of name where people knew them. There's a certain amount of affiliation that goes with, you're basically saying, look, do I want to make the most amount of money I can? I'll go with those companies. Do I want to work with a company that when I hand out my business card or I give them my QR, it's a company that I have great pride. I work for Google. I work for Apple. I work for Meta or Facebook. That's one of the reasons. And some companies, though, some smart people go for culture. They want to work with companies that are going to, help them move their careers where they think they're going to be developed. Why is this important to choose the right industry? I have a little data on this, and it comes from a study that we didn't do, but it was done by, it's called the American Opportunity Index. It's a corporate scorecard of worker advancement. There are 3 things that I learned from this study about why the choice of your employer has far bigger consequences than you probably realize. And I want to direct this to everybody, all groups, but I want to particularly talk about it in the context of these older workers. So for younger workers, it could make a $1.5 million difference in your career wages if you work for what's called a top quintile employer. Again, that quintiles being they divided companies into 5 categories. At the top are people who are very interested in developing you and promoting you and helping you in your career versus those who really don't. You just go in there, you punch a clock, you do your work, and you're out. It could be $1.5 million difference in career wages if you work for one of these top quintile companies, and that's almost 2.5 times more than your peers working in the same job, the same role that you have, but they're in one of the bottom quintile companies. You're 60% more likely to land a better job when you leave if you work for one of these top quintile companies, that are good at launching careers versus these bottom quintile firms. And a worker at a firm or a company that lags in how fast it advances employees would need to work a full year longer than a worker at a top quintile firm before being promoted. So this idea of everybody, but also older workers, choosing to work in the right industry and at the right employer, an employer that really needs their skills. Again, the authenticity of what I pointed out before, of what they bring to the table, which we didn't really talk about, but boomers and Gen X people, they have intrinsic organizational knowledge and human skills. They're less enticed by what I would call shiny new things. They're good mentors for future leaders in areas of strength like patience and deep thinking, stickiness. They're less reliant on sort of AI for answers, depending on their education experience, unique personal lens that they have. And, a lot of companies are absolutely hanging on, or put it this way. In the last year or 2 years, they did a lot of layoffs. And they came to us and they said, we really screwed up because we laid off people that have knowledge of our organization. And as we're speeding toward at light speed with some of these younger workers, we're having trouble wrangling them. Some of these people that we laid off could have been very, very helpful in terms of managing these younger workers and teaching them a few things that they don't know, while the younger generations are teaching us what we don't know.
No, all excellent points. David, you really, again, did a terrific job in laying out exactly what's in front of us vis-a-vis the big shift, focusing today, obviously, on the massive generational shift. And in subsequent conversations, we're going to be talking, just to reiterate, shifts in technology investments, job shifts, emphasizing soft skills, and shifts in skills pay, all of which you touched on today, but we'll obviously go a lot more in depth in subsequent podcasts. David, thanks so much.
Thank you, Charles. This was fun.
Yes, absolutely. Today's guest was David Foote, Chief Analyst and Chief Research Officer for the eponymous Foote Partners, innovators of advanced techniques for benchmarking enterprise tech jobs, skills supply/demand, and compensation, tracking/forecasting tech labor trends, and analyzing human factors in technology development. This is Charles Epstein for the X Factor podcast. Thanks for listening.